evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Well, last week all the experts were tipping a Labor win, but tonight Scott Morrison's government is on the way to a majority. Well, here to answer your questions tonight, broadcaster and commentator Alan Jones, political journalist for The Australian Alice Workman, former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne, who's now stepped away from parliamentary politics, Shadow Minister for Finance Jim Chalmers, who was Labor's election campaign spokesman, and business leader Ming Long. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Later, we'll be taking Skype and web questions from across the nation. But our first question comes from the audience. It's Angus Mullins.
Thank you. It was predicted that Brexit wouldn't happen, that Donald Trump wouldn't win the presidency, and that the coalition wouldn't win a third term. With the silent majority being touted as a reason behind recent Conservative successes, why is it that progressive parties such as Labor are so out of touch with the majority of voters?
I'll start with Alan Jones.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I thought it was always absurd that the party of the workers would go to an election campaign with their hand deeply in everybody's pocket. I mean, it didn't make sense that you could say a tax policy where you take $387 billion away, you'd alter negative gearing and jack up the price of rent and reduce the price of houses, you'd 50% increase capital gains tax, you'd take money from millions of self-funded retirees and say that they were rorting the system, and that's before you get the cost of energy policy. And at the end of the day, they poked the bear of the silent majority, and the silent majority has spoken, and the result is diabolical for the Labor Party because Scott Morrison has virtually won 2 elections on the one night. I mean, the vote in Queensland, 3 people in every 4 didn't vote Labor, and in New South Wales, in Australia, 2 people in every 3.
Alan, you're saying it's impossible for Labor to return after 3 years?
I don't think Labor have got any hope of winning the next election because the marginal coalition seats have now become very safe seats, and seats which had a margin of 0.06 have now got margins of 7 and 8%. And this is all because, go back to the question, and Jim, I know you were the architect of some of this, I could not believe that the Labor Party would sign what I called a national economic suicide note. And the people have voted accordingly, and workers, your own people, basically said, I can't support Labor. You had the Labor Party saying to miners, vote for me, and the miners are saying, what, to get rid of my job? So they put their jobs ahead of the party, and the result is there for everyone to see. OK, Jim Chalmers, touted as the architect of policies that fail. I mean, if you listen to that kind of recipe for disaster that Alan Jones just set out, does that sound like your policy? Your party, I should say? Well,
first of all, Angus, I mean, let's not get carried away and declare the outcome of the next election 3 years away, 48 hours after the last election. Alan, as usual, in his contribution then, spoke a whole lot of rubbish about Labor's policies. And unfortunately, that kind of rubbish, which has been repeated by Alan repeatedly over the last, not just the last 5 weeks, but longer than that, if we're honest about it, that found fertile ground in the community. And so what I wanted to say, and your question, Angus, gives me a good opportunity to do that, is I feel like we in the Labor Party, we did let down millions of people who needed us to win the election 48 hours ago. There were a lot of people who needed what we were proposing to do on childcare or pensioner dental or in terms of hospitals and schools, and we didn't get over the line. And I wanted to say to them through you, Angus, that we're very sorry about that. But our job now is not to engage in some year-long pity party or drag our asses around. Our job now is to rebuild and renew and refresh, because unlike Alan, I don't think the outcome of the election 3 years away was determined 48 hours ago.
Is it your job also to get rid of the various policies which turned out to be electoral poison, if Alan Jones is right, and he certainly appears to be, if you look at the vote?
Well, obviously the vote was disappointingly weak for us, heartbreakingly weak, particularly in my home state of Queensland. Very disappointing. And I'm not going to pretend that away. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat that. We fell short of what we were hoping to do. And obviously, in that context, you do need to listen and learn. Our policies will be a matter, obviously, for some consideration and conversation in the time ahead. I don't think anybody expects us to determine our policies for the next election 48 hours after the last one. So we'll take the time to listen and learn, rebuild, refresh and renew. And that's what people expect of us.
Just before I move on to the other panellists, how big a problem was it that the campaign was run and directed from Melbourne, that it had a Victorian focus and it was centred there so far away from Queensland where the disaster started?
Well, we ran our campaign from Parramatta in Western Sydney. And obviously, no matter where you run it from, you need to make sure that there's a diversity of voices. I think what we need to do tonight and generally is we need to resist the temptation to pretend that the election outcome was because of one thing. We always have this temptation to oversimplify. It's never about one thing, and it wasn't about one thing on Saturday. It was a combination of things. There was a scare campaign, as I said, in response to Alan that found fertile ground. I think it was dishonest, but it was also successful. We had very...
your policies, Jim. I was only quoting your policies. That's all I was doing.
Yeah, we had a very sustained campaign, personal campaign, against our leader, Bill Shorten. We had Clive Palmer, who made what was effectively a $60 million donation to the Liberal Party by running wall-to-wall ads bashing the Labor Party.
We're going to come to that.
So there are lots of reasons.
We're going to come to that. The right in New South Wales, obviously the campaign headquarters is in Parramatta, but there was a Victorian centrepiece there. I mean, you had, and what they're saying is the right, they ran a Victorian campaign nationally, but Victoria isn't North Queensland or Brisbane or Western Sydney. So the recriminations have already begun and they're pointing at those who ran the campaign.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't put it that way, Tony, but obviously when you look at Queensland, where we underperformed substantially, then we need to do something different there. We do need to give a greater emphasis to Queensland in our campaigning. That's self-evident from the result.
OK. We'll come
Tony,
back to
could I just start? Is Jim telling me that for the whole course of the campaign he didn't have any awareness that this was happening? I mean, it was a train wreck from day one. The voters were saying that, Labor voters. Are you telling me that you're in touch with the electorate and you didn't hear any of this and it was all a big surprise on Saturday night?
Alan seems to have forgotten whose show it is, Tony, but I'm happy to answer it.
It's going to be great if you two keep attacking each other.
That's right. Put the feet up.
It had to be a quick answer because we do need to go to the other panellists. Sorry about that.
Look, the result was never beyond doubt. And, you know, we thought that there was a prospect that we might get there, obviously. But we were nervous that things were difficult, particularly in Queensland.
OK. Christopher Pyne.
Well, I think elections are decided in the economy. And what Labor said at the election was we're going to tax a lot more than the Liberal Party are going to do, or the Liberal and the National Party. They couldn't explain the impact of their economic policies on people. I think the election really took a very bad turn in the first week when Bill Shorten couldn't tell people what the impact of his 45% emissions reduction target would be on the economy and dismissed the question. And actually, in elections, the Australian public want to know what the policies are going to do to their hip pocket. Every election in Australia is decided on the economy, and Labor, by election day, couldn't convince people that they knew what the impact of their policies were going to be, which were far-reaching. They were going to tax people a lot more, which they admitted. They had a big tax agenda. You can argue about the $387 billion, but by election day, the Australian public knew Labor would tax them a lot more. And they knew they were going to spend a lot more. And I think there are a few turning points in the election. One of them was the Labor Party just adopting the Coalition's policy for first home owners, first home buyers, after our campaign launch, without having done any work on it. So they sent a message to the Australian public that they were reckless around the economy and the budget. Now,
Just on that score, not a lot of work was done by the government. To be fair, I mean, there was no economic modelling.
We did the necessary work. We announced a policy. We knew how much it was going to cost.
There was no economic modelling of the policy.
Labor, the Prime Minister, the putative Prime Minister of Australia, couldn't tell people what a 45% emissions reduction target would do to the economy, and Labor wanted to fight the election on climate change, and their signature policy, he couldn't tell people what its economic effect was going to be.
But he couldn't tell you how long it would take to charge an electric car.
No, he couldn't.
Alice Workman.
What?
Angus, great question. You can buy the paper tomorrow because I've written a story covering this exact issue. I think one of the biggest problems with Labor's campaign, and you can see the strategy between the two major parties, is that climate change means different things to people that live in inner cities than it does to people in Queensland. Labor saw the biggest swings in Sydney, Adelaide and Melbourne, all in the inner city, where to people there climate change might mean something more about renewables and about saving the Great Barrier Reef, whereas in Queensland it means jobs. And the LNP in Queensland, Scott Morrison allowed them, unlike only a few months ago when Super Saturday happened and the LNP had the opportunity to pick up some seats in Queensland. Malcolm Turnbull wouldn't let the LNP run the campaign that they wanted to run on the ground, which is about jobs. And so it was run on innovation and these other ideas, even though they knew in Queensland that people didn't like what Bill Shorten was selling. And so what they did this time, Scott Morrison let all 151 seats run their own campaigns. So in Queensland, what they did was they came up with flyers where they copy-pasted Labor's policy about transitioning jobs from coal mining into renewables, and they handed it out to people. They did their own modelling, and they said, what does this mean in individual seats? There are seats up in the Whitsundays, ballots in the Whitsundays where last election, 2016, so not that long ago, they were voting 20% for the LNP. This is in Capricornia. Labor could have easily picked up this seat, and a lot of the tracking polling said they would. But the LNP ran a campaign hard. You know, George Christensen was standing up in pubs saying, we'll greenlight Adani, in seats, in places where the unemployment rate's 36%, saying, we'll greenlight Adani, we'll give you jobs. And when I asked a Labor person why in the Whitsundays, the only place in the country that's ever elected someone from the Communist Party is now voting 50% on marginal, so primary votes in marginal seats, you know, a seat that was only held on 0.8%. Why aren't they voting for the Labor Party when you're meant to be standing up for workers? And he said, well, what's the defence that we're running? We don't have a position on Adani. And the Greens ran an amazing campaign hijacking. Bob Brown went up into Queensland and convinced everyone who doesn't live in Queensland that there's only one mine in this country and it's Adani. When it's not.
They had two positions.
Well, and this was confusing.
Bill had a position in Melbourne on Adani and a position in North Queensland on Adani.
And Labor's candidate in Flynn had his hands tied. And he was asked many times, he lost friends over this campaign because he couldn't stand up in public and say he was pro-Adani.
Alice, I'm going to move on. We're going to
Can I just say quickly, the CFMEU was running with the LNP in Queensland because 300,000 people across this country work in resources. And they believed that if the Labor Party was elected, whether it be true or not, that they would lose their jobs. And that explains a lot in Queensland and Tasmania, I think.
Ming Long. And the question was, we'll come back to it, why is it the progressive parties, such as the Labor Party, are out of touch with the majority of voters? Do you believe that's the case?
Look, I think it's right what Christopher's saying with respect to economics being a really big driver for Australian voters, because really, you know, as Alice has said, if you're unemployed in Queensland, I can understand why you would not care about climate, because the last thing you're thinking about is climate. You're thinking about your own survival, your own, what's going to happen to your own career or your own survival. I think it's quite important for parties to ensure that they have a diversity of opinions in their ranks. So they're actually listening to the people in the community. I think a lot of times you can sit in a bubble, whether it's in Sydney or in all of the other capital cities. We tend to listen to each other. We tend to listen to just people who agree with us. And there needs to be a lot more listening of people who, you know, we don't agree with, and to understand their position. Unfortunately, though, I think, you know, I watch politics and it is so toxic at times, and I can understand why people turn off, because really you're just, you know, something, you're just having a go at each other and you're not listening to the people who have real issues that politics needs to solve. So I can see why people turn off the major parties. They turn off listening to elections, people who didn't even know who our Prime Minister was, because they've been so appalled at what's happened. So I do think it's important that we recognise with the Labor Party, though, that you know, regardless of how Bill Shorten was seen, and he, you know, was seen to be quite unpopular for a very long time, he had the discipline to hold the party together. And the one thing that, you know, I've been really annoyed at with politics is the revolving prime ministers that we have. I would not want the Liberal coalition party to look at this election and think, hey, we can change leaders again and it's okay, the electorate will vote us back in.
That's pretty unlikely, Ming, but we'll come back to that. Now, the next question,
the rules as well.
The next question comes via Skype. It's from Paul Keary in Northley, New South Wales.
Jim Chalmers. Thanks, Tony. Jim Chalmers, the Labor Party was foolhardy to propose the removal of franking credit refunds from some retirees, but not from others. It didn't make sense. If Labor had won the election, my income would have been reduced by almost 20%, from $40,800 to $32,800 per year. Now, will Labor admit that it made a mistake in taxing retirees so hard? And will Labor apologise for this monumental blunder?
Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Paul. Obviously, the view that we took to the election was that we couldn't continue to have $6 or $8 billion out of the budget each year on the basis that 96% of the population were subsidising a tax break which was enjoyed by 4% of the population.
OK, now we understand, we've had this debate a lot. The question we've just heard there is whether that will remain your policy, given the shellacking you've gotten from the over 65s.
Well, look, all of these policies are obviously, after an election loss, they're up for review, they're up for discussion, they're up for further consideration.
You can dump them when you become the next Labor leader, Jim.
They're all up for consideration, and
What do you personally think? I mean, you're the shadow finance minister. You've heard from Paul, wasn't it? Yes, you've heard from Paul, but there are thousands of Pauls out there and many other women in the same situation who said, we're not earning that much money and you're going to take money away from us in our retirement, which we planned for. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, was that a big blunder, as he asks?
Well, I don't think it explains the election result on its own for the same reason. Well, the same reasons I said before. It's never one thing when you lose an election. And in fairness to Paul, that's not the first time I've heard Paul's argument. I've heard that, engaging around the country.
But Tony, the argument that these people haven't paid taxes is nonsense. The tax has been paid by the company. And in the 1998 Labor Party manifesto of Kim Beazley's, he says this: Labor will provide a cash refund for those shareholders who can't make use of their imputation credits because they don't pay income tax. He said this will be a significant benefit for older Australians, especially self-funded retirees on lower incomes, and it's fair. Kim Beazley. Now, suddenly you're standing all of this on its head on the untruth that these people are getting a refund when they don't pay tax.
Alan, I'm going to interrupt you because Paul, who asked the question, wants to come back, and we'll take a quick comment from him. Paul?
Yes, well, Tony, Chris Bowen was warned about this during the election. He could have modified the policy, and I just don't know why he didn't. He could have made it fairer. He could have capped these, suggested that they be capped, and that would have made at least a little more sense. So it was just it was a train wreck. It was the wrong thing, and it could have swung the whole election, in my opinion. Retirees like me were totally confused and couldn't understand it at all. It was targeting one particular section of the community. It was not fair.
OK, we've got another question on this before I come to the other panellists. It's from Andrew Fulton. Andrew?
Yes, Jim. Labor initially emphasised taxing the wealthy and giving to the poor, with hitting the big end of town and franking credits. This was not a fair go for Australians, as your initial campaign slogans kept trying to tell us. It was badly scripted and typical socialist rhetoric from an age long past. How did you misjudge the mood and intelligence of the Australian people so badly?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, Andrew. The motivation for the policies that we took to the election on Saturday was a recognition that we've got a heap of challenges in the budget and in the economy. In the budget, we've had debt which has doubled. Public debt has doubled in the last 6 years. You don't hear that enough. We've got a big problem with debt. We've got a big problem in funding hospitals and schools and childcare and the nation's priorities. And what we said in the election was we were upfront with people and we said there are some tax concessions available to a sliver of the population that the country can't afford anymore. And the alternative would have been what Tony Abbott did in 2013, which is to pretend everything was hunky-dory and then to pop up after the election and do all of these sorts of things that we hadn't got a mandate for. Now, obviously, after an election result like what we copped on Saturday night, we have to reflect on that, obviously. And I'm not, again, like Angus's question, I'm not going to pretend that we don't need to give consideration to all of these policies. But they are based in budgetary reality and economic reality. And I know that...
Were they, you heard the sense from the questioners, they're saying both of them, there was political poison for the Labor Party. So it's the obvious issue is, would you go back and drink that poison again?
Well, I keep saying in different ways that obviously we need to have a discussion about our policies. We're not going to announce our policies 48 hours after an election for an election 3 years down the track. But what I do want to say, Tony, because I think this is crucial, there's an economic basis to what we were proposing to do. We do have a big problem in this country with the budget, with the economy. People on low and middle incomes don't have the disposable income or the wages growth that they need to deal with the cost of living. And we had a proposal to deal with that. The Australian people did not support us at the election. That's self-evident. And so we go back to the drawing board, we rebuild, we renew, we refresh.
Okay. All right.
Now, Tony, the policy, Labor talked about fairness.
Alan, I'm going to interrupt you there because Christopher Pyne deserves a go. Didn't want to get in for a
I
while.
do deserve a go.
Go ahead.
How would you have fixed it, Christopher?
I had to say, I think, as a political professional of more than a quarter of a century, when Labor announced this policy about the retirees' tax, that was when I first started to think that the coalition could win the election.
Let's just get this right. They didn't announce a tax.
Well, they announced this franking credits policy. And
exactly.
Why I thought that was because it wasn't just the over 65s who were bewildered, as the two questioners have indicated, but all their families as well. And these are a very well-connected group of people. Retirees can't go out and get a new job. So they watch their dollars very closely. And when they saw that they were going to lose money, they're all on the internet, they're very connected to their own newsletters and newspapers and magazines. They would have said to all of their children and grandchildren, if I lose $2,000 a year or $20,000 a year, whatever it might be, that's Christmas presents, that's holidays, that's meals out with my family. That would have connected right through the community. And I think if there is one policy that cost Labor the election, it was definitely the retirees' tax.
OK, we're going to move on. We've got a question related to our previous questions from Alan Hamilton. Go on, Alan.
My question is Jim Chalmers. Under a Labor Party that you lead, will the term big end of town be dead, buried and cremated?
Let's hope so.
Jim Chalmers.
Well, I won't sign up to the first assumption in your question, but, you know, on the language that we use, whether you call it the big end of town, whether you call it people in the highest income tax bracket or whether you call it, you know, multinational corporations, the budget as it's currently constructed under the Liberal Party relies on cuts to hospitals and schools and goes easy on people who need money the least. And I think that's an economic challenge. See, this economy is slowing, unemployment is rising, jobs are insecure, wages are stagnant. These are our economic challenges, and no matter what happened in the election 2 days ago, those challenges remain, right?
Just a quick one. No apologies for the use of the term big end of town, which is right at the fundamental edge of that question.
No.
I think that was a mad thing.
Well, the big end of town is 3% of Australians. 3% of Australians is the big end of town, who pay 30% of all income tax. Now, on the previous question...
Talking about people who make more than $200,000.
You keep talking about fairness. The Labor Party keeps talking about fairness, and on the dividend imputation, you have two different kinds of taxes for the same shareholders. Some shareholders get the refund and other shareholders don't, and the ones who don't are the poor people. How's that fair? Jim, it doesn't make sense, and the people will wake up to you.
Alice Workman wanted to jump in there.
Well, I think we should go back to Alan's question, which was under a Labor Party that Jim Chalmers leads. Jim, are you ready to rule in or out whether you'll run for the Labor leadership? I know you probably don't want to do it on Q&A, but can you embargo it till tomorrow morning? I'm sure no one...
All the journalists on this table are going to be asking the same question.
Everyone's watching Game of Thrones, Jim. No one will know.
I won't. Can I answer, though? A different way.
Just hold on.
Run for Labor leader.
Are you going to stand up and put your hand up for the Labor leadership as a new generation, and a Queenslander, after all, when the great deficit that your party faced the worst deficit was in Queensland?
I'm considering it. I'm talking to my colleagues about it. I don't think it's unreasonable that a few of us take some time to work out what we want to do. Remember that we were hoping to be forming a cabinet this week. We weren't complacent about that, but we were hoping to be cabinet ministers. I was hoping to front up tonight as the Minister for Finance. We had a heartbreaking defeat on Saturday, and we've got to deal with that. So I think it's reasonable that I take some time to have a think about it, talk to my colleagues about it, and see where it goes from there. But
and you would be pitching as the next generation of Labor, who could be out of power for a long time, potentially, if Alan Jones is right about the 2-election win. A younger leader getting his bearings over 6 years, potentially. Would that be your pitch? And a Queenslander to boot?
I'd put it this way.
That's good.
I want to play a substantial role in the rebuilding of our electoral fortunes, the rebuilding of our policies up to the next election. The exact nature of that substantial role, I think, is to be determined. I've got a mountain of respect for other colleagues who are capable of leading our party, and so I want to take the time to consult properly with people.
Ming Long, the only reason this is actually coming up, really, I suppose, because Tanya Plibersek has pulled out of the race. Anthony Albanese is the last man standing, but obviously younger Labor MPs are considering leadership. What do you think about the fact that a woman has pulled out?
I mean, I would have loved for her to put up her hand. And I heard that she pulled out. She's got family responsibilities, which is obviously very important to all of us, that you look after your family. When I have a look at what happened on Saturday, do I feel like our country is ready for another female Prime Minister? I am not sure. And I'm just so sad to say that I can sit here and say we're not ready as a country, because we should be ready as a country. It should not matter what your gender is or what your background is. But you have to face the reality of where we are. And I think...
Where are we, by the way? I mean, where's your evidence that we would never want to have a female leader?
Not never. I mean, okay, if we're never, then we need to have a really hard look at ourselves.
The country's not ready for it. We already had a female Prime Minister.
Yeah, we had a female Prime Minister, and then I look at how she was treated, and it wasn't great. And do I feel like the electorate is ready for another female leader of a country without her gender being, front and centre in everybody's minds? I don't think it is, unfortunately. So I do think that we need to, as a country, think about what is important to us. Women represent 51% of our population, and they deserve to have a chance to lead the country without gender being an issue. Let me throw that to Alice, and
you can also reflect on who you think might end up as being the Labor leader. Obviously, that's going to be very likely a contested battle with a number of... Oh, Chris Bowen, I obviously didn't mention earlier.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be a fascinating thing because New South Wales is obviously also having to pick their leader at the moment. So to see Anthony Albanese and potentially other members of the right put their hand up in New South Wales, it'll be pretty interesting. I think Victoria's a bit on the nose, so no one there will likely put their hand up. But just on what Ming was saying, the one positive thing I think we can say about the 46th Parliament, if you're not happy with the result, is we have a record number of female politicians who have been elected. There are over 80, which means that women make up more than a third for the first time in Australian history. So it's taken a long time, but that's a great number. I will also say that the Labor Party have more than half their senators are women. Which is an amazing achievement, and I think the parties have made some policy decisions behind the scenes that will have changed that shape. So I'm really excited about that, and I can't wait to see what happens. And the coalition have some great new women coming along who look like they could be in the outer ministry as well, which is very exciting. But in terms of the Labor leadership, there's one kind of historical fact which I love to tell people, which is that someone that has served as a full term as an opposition leader has never won an election. So, you know, the cynic in me probably says, well, maybe that's a factor in people deciding not to put their hands up. They might wait and see how the Morrison government plays out over the next 2 years, and whoever the Labor Party picks, they might change their mind in 2 or 3 years' time. I know that Ming probably won't like that, but that's the reality of politics at the moment. So it's a wait and see.
There's no doubt at all that the fact that Bill Shorten was the leader of the opposition for almost 6 years did not help. And because people got to know Bill Shorten, they didn't like it, whether that's fair or unfair. They didn't like what they saw with Bill, and he found it impossible to change their perceptions because he'd been there for so long that their view of him had become quite settled. And we saw in the election he just could not shift that really unpopular number.
And the one thing that
Christopher,
people...
who do you think would be the toughest opponent now for Scott Morrison?
Well, I don't agree with Ming, by the way. I don't think there's any particular time that we're ready or not ready for a woman Prime Minister. I think the Australian public would happily embrace a woman Prime Minister if either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party selected a woman as their Prime Minister, because I think Julia Gillard has broken that glass ceiling. I think that's a great thing. Obviously, I wanted her to be defeated, but I think it's a great thing that we've had a woman Prime Minister.
Sorry, the question that I just asked you,
I don't think you can assume that the glass ceiling is broken just because one person has made it through.
So the question I just asked you, Christopher, was who would be the toughest opponent now for Scott Morrison?
Well, it's not my job to give the Labor Party advice about how to defeat my... Not my job to do that.
All right.
On the this glass ceiling, there was no glass ceiling for Carmen Lawrence. There was no glass ceiling for Gladys Berejiklian or Anastasia Palaszczuk. I agree with Christopher. I mean, women, I think we're inventing things here. There's a good woman. I've never heard anyone argue against someone because she was a woman, and there's been very good women. But the argument here is... No, well, where's the glass ceiling for Berejiklian or Anastasia Palaszczuk?
Anna Bligh.
I mean, the issue here is who's going to be the leader. And Jim, I think many people...
You may have forgotten the Ditch the Witch campaign against Julia Gillard,
Yes, well,
which I seem to remember you had some right.
Let me just correct the record. I've never uttered those words in my life. No. But if I just come back to you, Jim...
You'd apologise.
I think
many
said worse than that, actually. You said worse.
I'll just come back to Jim. Many people would have thought that someone of your generation would be the likely candidate. But as you know, the rank and file get a vote in this leadership issue. And the rank and file in the Labor Party are very, very angry about the economic policies taken to the election. And if you are seen by the rank and file as one of the authors of those policies, it's going to be a very, very inhibiting factor in terms of you getting support from the rank and file. So if Albanese hasn't been part of that leadership that put those policies together, then I think he most probably got a walk-up start.
OK, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Kylie Harris.
Clive Palmer is said to have spent around $60 million promoting his United Australia Party and his own Senate bid. Many are now saying this money was for nothing, with the United Australia Party only gaining 3.5% of the vote and not a single seat. But Clive Palmer himself is crediting his campaign for the coalition's success and the Labor's defeat. Do you think Clive Palmer bought the election for the coalition and Scott Morrison?
Alice Workman, start with you. By the way, Clive Palmer was a big boogeyman for the Australian for a while there. They seem to have gone quiet on that.
Could possibly comment on that, it's above my pay grade, but I think the analysis is fundamentally correct in terms of the disenchantment in Australian politics. We know historically that people are making their decisions when they walk into polling booths or switching over when a news story comes up, so they're hearing less, and what they are hearing are attack ads like Clive Palmer that dispel things down into really simple three-word slogans, if you want to put it that way. What he managed to do was run attack ads that, you know, managed to attack the coalition slightly but attack Labor more, and that really played out well in Queensland. Of course, he didn't get a Senate seat. I think Australians, thank God, are much more too sensible to give him a Senate seat, so he won't be returning to Canberra, but he perpetuated absolute lies about Labor's policies. I wrote a long piece for the Weekend Australian 2 weeks ago about the death tax and the inheritance tax, where this myth was perpetuated that just ad nauseum, people like Jim coming out and saying we're absolutely not doing it. People fundamentally believed that if the Labor Party was elected, that their inheritance would be taxed. That's what they were saying when they were going in and out of polling booths on Saturday. So he ran a campaign like that and brought up those myths. And so he did help the coalition more than he helped Labor.
OK, Jim Chalmers, the question was, did he buy the election effectively for the coalition?
Well, it was effectively a $60 million donation to the Liberal Party because, as Alice rightly points out, he did nothing to help his own cause but did a lot to damage Labor's cause, and I think Scott Morrison has a debt to Clive Palmer now, and this is what we were warning about. It is problematic that you've got a Prime Minister who's prepared to do a deal with someone like Clive Palmer, who is prepared to throw $60 million at those kind of lies that Alice talked about. On my polling booths on election day, people were coming up to me about the death tax on and on. It's never been part of our policy. It was never going to be a part of our policy, never will be part of our policy. But when you throw $60 million at a lie, it's going to work. And so that effective donation that he made to the Liberal Party is a big part of the story of what happened on Saturday.
I just think that there's so much sore losering going on. The truth is that I don't hear anybody saying it's outrageous that GetUp spent $10 million trying to unseat particular coalition MPs with their army of people, volunteers across Australia, or that the ACTU shouldn't be allowed to spend money on election campaigns. They spent millions and millions of dollars. Or that the Greens are not a risk to the Australian economy with their policies that Labor is happy to go into alliance with, as they did in the 43rd Parliament. Now, it's a free country. I don't agree with what Clive Palmer said in a lot of his ads. A lot of it was complete and utter rubbish. But it's a free country. He wanted to spend his money. He wanted to stop Bill Shorten being...
Actually, it's an expensive country if it's $60 million.
Hang on. You know, it's OK to sneer at Clive Palmer, but he chose to spend his own...
Clive Palmer.
Well, because...
We're simply saying that he spent $60 million.
Yeah. Well, that's his business.
When simultaneously he owes more than $70 million to the Australian taxpayer.
It's his business. It's his business whether he spends $60 million, right? And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we don't like what GetUp's done. We don't like what the ACTU does. They don't campaign for us. They don't donate to our campaigns. The ACTU is an open channel of funds to the Labor Party from their members. That's the way things are. And for Labor to try and blame Clive Palmer...
Is Palmer now your ACTU?
No, look, Clive Palmer can do what he likes with his money.
Well, it should also be pointed out that Clive Palmer was a campaigner for the LNP. He ran their campaigns in Queensland.
Well,
he only started his own party.
Decades ago.
But he only started his own party because he couldn't get Liberal pre-selection.
Well, how outrageous. So this man who's made all this money wants to spend it to stop Labor getting elected, and somehow this is the worst thing that ever happened.
OK.
I'd like the same standard to be applied to GetUp and the Greens and the ACTU.
Okay. It's a reasonable point you're making. Ming Long.
I saw some ads. I was really annoyed at them. I know a lot of people who saw them on social media came out and said, oh my God, did you see those ads? They're just completely outrageous. I don't assume he's stupid. That, you know, a lot of people are thinking that, oh my God, he just blew, you know, $60 million for nothing. He's a businessman. He wants an investment for that $60 million return. Right. And I think it's important for the journalists and the media in our country to keep an eye on, is there a deal? Is he getting some sort of payback for that? I don't know. It's above my pay grade too. I think it's also important,
kind of an allegation, and it's completely outrageous.
If you want to know more about following the money is really important. And I think that Will Glasgow, who writes a margin call column for us, did a great interview on my podcast, The Scrutiny, is available now, where he said if you follow the money of Clive Palmer's campaign, it comes back to his coal mines. He wants to get into Parliament to have a crossbench position so that he can influence the amount of tax that he pays and the amount of royalties that he gets. And that's just the truth of it.
Okay.
And it is his right to form his own party to campaign on these issues. But at the end of the day, he can run as many memes as he wants on Facebook, but he's not doing things for the Australian people. He's thinking about himself.
Maybe Labor should have campaigned.
Can I just ask Alan? Sorry, you're listening, shaking your head silently. Your view on Clive Palmer, and I have to say, can you take on board the notion that he effectively owes $70 million to the Australian taxpayer, and so we may have in fact funded that $60 million?
Well, look, this is not... I mean, I could argue that position, whether or not that's correct, but that's not actually germane to what the point is being made here, although it is a valid question. The business about Clive Palmer spending money, apart from the fact that it's his own business. And, of course, Jim says, oh, well, he spent all his money on death duties. He didn't do that at all. His aim, and he stated it publicly and unequivocally, was to prevent Bill Shorten becoming Prime Minister. He's entitled to do that. And I would have thought if there's business people at the table here, they might choose to answer the question as to how on earth business would have managed the burden of tax that was being foisted upon them should Labor win. And Palmer spoke in an educative way in those short things, telling people what the risks were. And he made it quite clear. And he said that today, well, I've stopped all these taxes being levied on corporations and individuals. And we outlined what those taxes are here tonight. And we've seen the result in the electorate. Now, Andrew Leigh, if you want to talk about death duties, Jim, Andrew Leigh's a professor of economics at ANU. He's your shadow assistant treasurer. Rightly or wrongly, he did say only about 6 years ago that he believed there should be an inheritance tax.
It was 2006.
He's made the comment that it should be an inheritance tax. Julian Burnside was only recently endorsed as a Greens candidate. The Greens are in partnership with Labor, give all their preferences to Labor. And what would Greens expect from Labor if they supported them? Well, Julian Burnside said there should be death duties. Now, there was ambiguity about all of this.
You're drawing a very long bow, Alan.
Well, there was ambiguity about this. And
This is the kind of absurdity that dominated the election campaign.
Bill Shorten never once addressed the issue of death duties. Never once.
That's a total lie. From beginning to end, that's a lie. From beginning to end, a lie.
You find for me where Bill Shorten said anything about death duties.
I'm happy to do that. We had to repeatedly say that it wasn't our policy.
He did say on numerous occasions they weren't doing it.
Many times.
That's what you mean.
Yeah. So can I just add one more thing?
This is what we're up against.
To your question, I would love to see government look at misleading and deceptive advertising in political campaigns, please, because we deserve better.
Legislation?
Would love it, please.
All right, you're watching the first Q&A since the election. The next question turns to the other side of this election is from James Jeffrey. James.
Just today, social media picked up some similarities between ScoMo and Bob Hawke having a beer while watching the footy. Like Bob Hawke, could ScoMo be the next PM of the people?
Alice, start with you.
Well, that's what Scott Morrison talked about when he talked about quiet Australians in his election victory speech, and that's what he has always set out to do. I think that it might be hard for some people who remember him as Immigration Minister or Social Services Minister or even as Treasurer, where I remember once he told me that he didn't believe that Treasurers should be liked because they have to make hard decisions. And that's a tough transition into the Prime Minister where, you know, it is a popularity contest, even though we're not American, we don't directly vote for Prime Minister. It is a popularity contest because you're selling your policies and you're selling your party. And I think that I'm a true believer in that kicking a football and having a beer is super relatable and people love it. When Scott Morrison went to Tasmania and he met the man with the best mullet in this country, that guy said he was interviewed afterwards and he said, he's just a normal bloke, he's relatable, he's got a football team. We had a chat about it, we went around the back, he kicked the AFL, it was all great. And getting your hands dirty on the campaign is a tried and true method of getting people to like you. And that's what Scott Morrison fundamentally did.
And Scott also loved the campaign. I mean, he looked like he was really enjoying it. He liked getting out and talking to the people. He didn't look harassed and harried or grumpy. I have to say I thought Bill looked grumpy for most of the campaign. It was like he was basically saying, why do I have to go through this campaign when obviously I'm going to be the Prime Minister? I mean, Labor was so overconfident for so long.
Okay.
And I mean,
we're
Bill
done
eats
talking.
his sausage. Bill eats his sausage from the middle. I mean,
the campaign's over. We're not talking about Labor anymore. We've moved on to Scott Morrison. Here's an obvious question for you. In retrospect,
got the chance to be a long-term Prime Minister.
In retrospect, then, do you think it was the right thing for the Liberal Party room to overthrow Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, both Scott Morrison and I supported Malcolm Turnbull right through to the end, and in fact tried to avoid any leadership change, and I think Malcolm would have won.
There are different views, by the way.
Well, of course there's different views. It's a democracy.
What Scott Morrison did in the lead-up.
No, there isn't. I was there for every moment of it, and I can tell you that he was absolutely and 100% supportive of Malcolm Turnbull right through to the last moment. So there's a whole lot of mythology that's been created, but it's actually not true.
OK, so given how well he campaigned, did it turn out to be the right thing? Would Malcolm Turnbull have done as well in this campaign? Well,
I think what Scott did was take us from a position of being 54-46 after leadership changed to winning the election on Saturday, probably about 51.5 to 48.5. Now, that is an amazing achievement. Malcolm was only 49-51 at the time, if you remember. So I think Malcolm would have won the election as well. But we'll never know that. There'll be people who say that he wouldn't. There'll be people who say that he would, because it's completely unprovable. But I don't think that we should have changed the leader. I still believe that, and I'm sure Scott would say the same thing. But, you know, he's made the best of a very bad situation. We gave ourselves quite a handicap last August by having this disunity, and we've been forgiven by the Australian public. I think counterintuitively, a lot of people thought, why would we add to the chaos by changing the Prime Minister again?
Did you make a mistake leaving? I mean...
No, I'm very happy to. I've been there 26 years. How long can a good thing keep going for?
No, fair enough. Alan Jones, the
Like
question about
winks.
Scott Morrison and his place in political history, but also him as a campaigner.
Well, I think Scott would be embarrassed if his name was mentioned in the same sentence as Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke was a unique individual who made a phenomenal contribution to this country, and he had just a wonderful rapport. Scott would aim, I guess, at the end of the day to have that kind of record, but Scott would say, look, I'm only a starter here. Bob Hawke has history on his side. Bob Hawke, I used to say, won 4 elections at the racecourse, and I've seen him walk into the racecourse and a bloke would shout out, Bob, you got us a tip? And Bob would have his form guide in his pocket and he'd read a name out, and they thought that was fantastic. And I remember on one occasion, in fact it was on my program, that he changed the whole business about higher education and introduced that HEX payment, and he asked to come on and he was going to justify it. And his justification was that, well, in an ideal world it's perfect that we have free university education, but he said there's a whole lot of people out there who vote for me who'll never get inside a university gate, and they're contributing to people who do, and whose education is going to help them gain more in life, and I don't think they actually should be paying as much as they're paying. So he really had an understanding, Bob Hawke, of what motivated people, and he had a wonderful capacity to seek rapport with all sections, the business community, the sporting community, and the average Joe out there who was struggling. Scott Morrison, I think, is down that track. He campaigns very, very well. You're right, Christopher, he's energetic, he's enthusiastic. He genuinely loves it and wants to do it, but he would say, I've got the job in front of me if I'm going to be mentioned in the same breath as Bob Hawke.
Jim Chalmers, the other part of that question is he did campaign very well. He did have broad appeal. That's been proven by the results. The comparison, obviously, has been made is with Bill Shorten. Was he the wrong person for Labor to go to this election with as leader?
Look, Bill Shorten did a range of pretty remarkable things. After 2013, when we hit the fence in the 2013 election, he brought the party together. He genuinely united the party for 6 years. He deserves credit for that. He won objectively, not my opinion, but you know, in the wash-up of the 3 debates, he won the 3 debates. He withstood some pretty horrific personal attacks. He did all of those sorts of things, and he fell short, right? And I don't think it's fair to blame Bill or any other one person for the outcome that we got on Saturday. The 2 points of common ground that I wanted to strike with Alan and also with Chris in response to James's question, but also Kylie's and Angus's. Australians hate 2 things: sore losers and bad winners, right? They don't want us to walk around the country for 3 years whinging about the outcome or the result. They don't want the Liberal Party to, you know, claim that they're going to win the next election because they won the last one. They hate bad winners, they hate bad losers. And you alluded to that, Chris, before. I think you're right in the sense that we can't be bad losers in the Labor Party. The other thing I agree with from Alan is that it's possible to think that Scott Morrison ran an effective campaign, it was ultimately a successful campaign, but also to conclude that even in his wildest dreams, he is not a cracker compared to Bob Hawke. I mean, Bob Hawke was one of a kind. And on Thursday night, we lost one of the greatest Australians ever. And I think one of the heartening things, Tony Abbott aside, John Howard aside, is that almost the entire country came together at that moment and recognised that we had lost something extraordinary.
Ming Long.
Which question am I
Well,
answering?
there's really
Am I answering Bob Hawke? Am I answering?
Well, the questioner wound in Bob Hawke's appeal to ordinary Australians in a question about Scott Morrison's campaign.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I did also observe there was the beer drinking, like constant beer drinking going on. I don't drink, so I didn't relate to it as well. But, you know, you have to be a man of the people. You have to be a person that I think people relate to.
Or a woman of the people.
A woman of the people.
Woman of the people, please, at one point during my lifetime. The interesting comparison though with Bob and you know, I was an economics student in the Hawke Keating eras. That was an amazing time of reform that I honestly have not seen again. And that's really unfortunate. But I do think that Scott Morrison has an opportunity because he doesn't have any former prime ministers in the parliament. And if he really wanted to make sure that he got in and neutralised the opposition in the next election, if he actually dealt substantially with climate change, he would potentially become legendary in his own party. So there is an opportunity for him to be in for more than you know, one term, more than 2 terms potentially, if he actually substantially dealt with that particular issue. Because I do think
we've got a question on that, so I'm going to go to questions on climate change now. And the first one's from Ashley Condon.
The effects of climate change will most adversely affect the Australian youth. With recent protests and political involvement of school-aged children juxtaposed to the disinterest of many Australian voters, does the panel think the voting age should be lowered, or perhaps should an opt-in voting arrangement for teenagers be considered?
Alice, we'll start with you. Representative Young Australia.
Actually not that young, Tony. This is an interesting question because the Greens have a policy that they think the voting age should be lowered to 16. When Sam Dastyari was in the Senate, he also floated the idea. Interesting to note that Labor, if elected, we're going to reappoint someone as youth minister. We haven't had a youth minister in a very long time. You know, we have an ageing minister, but not a youth minister, which is a decision that the coalition's obviously come to. I think it's an interesting prospect, an opt-in system, but the difficulty that I have with it is that compulsory voting is one of the things that I think makes Australian democracy great. I think that a lot of 16-year-olds, you could possibly make the argument, aren't mature enough, they aren't educated enough, they're not there yet. 18 is the legal age in Australia, and I think that we've set it there for a reason. But one of the things that I am buoyed by is that after the postal survey that we had to have, so many young people were enrolled. We had a record number of young enrollers, and I think people born in the year 2000 voted on Saturday, which is really exciting. And politics will change. I know that I was talking to some younger voters for the first time, explaining politics to them and where the parties sit. And, you know, they didn't agree with a lot of policies from both the major parties. They thought that they weren't progressive enough. They wanted immediate change. You know, it'll take a while, and with a new generation potentially coming up in Labor, we will see things change, and hopefully we will see more women, and we will see a climate policy from the coalition, possibly.
Alice, I'm going to just interrupt you because we've got a web question that came in. It's from Katie Graham in Launceston, Tasmania. What do you think happened to the higher number of younger voters because of the same-sex marriage vote that was predicted to help Labor and the Greens? And actually, I'll throw that to Jim. Did you get your demographics wrong? Because obviously you pitched a lot of your campaigning to younger voters. Obviously, the older voters seem to have had a sway.
I don't know that there's a way to determine, to break out the vote on the weekend by age groups. And I think if there's one thing that we've learned from the campaign just gone is that the opinion polling and exit polling and all of that is becoming less and less accurate. I'm proud of the way that we appealed to younger people in this country. And I think, you know, Ashley's question about climate change, I mean, we need to be careful that the history of what happened 2 days ago is not completely rewritten when it comes to climate change. The Australian people overwhelmingly want to deal with it. And they understand that renewable energy is cheaper, can be good for jobs and good
When you
for the
say
economy.
overwhelmingly, are you leaving North Queensland out of that?
Well, clearly in central Queensland and in North Queensland, we had a problem. And that's reflected in the results. And somebody else, I think Alice mentioned what happened in the electorate of Flynn, we had an outstanding candidate there, Zach Beers, who's a great guy, and he copped a big swing against him, and we would be dishonest if we tried to claim that coal didn't play a part in that. But nationally, overwhelmingly, people want us to deal with climate change. Renewable energy needs to be a bigger component of the mix going forward. That doesn't mean that coal doesn't play an important role. Coal is essential to the economies of central and north Queensland. I know that as a Queenslander.
Do you think the importance of coal just got greater as far as the Labor Party is concerned after this election?
Well, I don't think that the Adani mine will be an issue in the 2022 election. I do think that it played a role in the swings that we got in Capricornia and Flynn and Dawson and Herbert in the election just gone. But it would be a mistake for us to fight the next election on the basis of the last one.
Yeah, but you're essentially saying there's a future for coal.
We've always said that. I mean, we have always said that coal will be an important part of the economy for the foreseeable future. We have always said that. There didn't
seem to be a big campaign message.
I have said that. I have said that repeatedly.
All right.
But didn't you also, it wasn't one of your transition policy, didn't it also say that you would look at legislating in your first term, pool redundancies for people to transition them out of the coal mining industry?
Well,
don't you think that that was one of the big reasons why in Queensland people turned away from your policies?
No, not necessarily. I think coal did play a part. I've already conceded that. But what you're talking about is we've got all of these 45 and 50-year-old power assets which are closing down. And what we're saying to the workers in those energy assets, if they're closing down, we won't leave you on your own. Our message is a pro-worker message in those communities, and we've seen it in the Latrobe Valley and elsewhere.
And that was lost in the Hunter Valley.
We can't say to people that you're on your own if your source of employment closes down. And so, yes, we had an issue. Yes, we had an issue in central and north Queensland, but it's not because we had a policy for people who lose their job as a result of energy assets closing down.
I think one of the dangers in the Labor Party's campaign was that it was trying to set people against each other, that somehow retirees were taking money that should be going to young people, that the coal industry was hurting the environment, which made all the people in the coal industry think that they were doing something bad by being in the industry which drives our energy. There was a real class warfare angle to Labor's campaign, and I think Australians, because we're a great egalitarian society, rejected it.
And I think it's also about affluence.
I'm just going to interrupt you because we'll come back to that, Alice, because we've got time for one last question. It's on the same subject, actually. It's just a different perspective. It's from Ross Hughes.
Tony, action on climate change was identified as an important issue for this election. Yet voters returned a government that's previously been paralysed by climate change deniers. Is there a chance that this is a policy area that in the future Scott Morrison will be able to exercise that authority that he has as a hero of bringing the coalition back to government? Will he be able to exercise his influence in that policy area to bring about changes, or will the climate change deniers feel empowered to prosecute their agenda again?
Christopher Pyne, we'll start with you.
Well, I think Scott Morrison has just won the greatest amount of authority of any leader of the Liberal Party since John Howard. I mean, the reality is he's won an election which was supposed to be the unwinnable election. So the authority that he carries means that he will be able to determine a lot of the policy direction in a way that the past few leaders have not had that unity. In terms of climate, what we've tried to do in the last 6 years is do practical things that meet our targets, our Paris Agreement targets, the Kyoto ones, of course, right back in history, in the last few years, more than a decade. And we've done that, and we've done it because we've been putting practical policies into place. Now, we're not part of that green left agenda that says we have to close down coal and everyone has to have renewable or solar, but we're not against renewable or against solar. We're in favour. We're agnostic about it.
We're sort of running out of time. What message will Scott Morrison take from the Liberal seats, sometimes blue ribbon Liberal seats, where there's a big backlash around the issue of climate change? Even Josh Frydenberg's seat.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I think that is another one of the mythologies. See, I think Labor and their friends have convinced themselves of a whole lot of myths. Now, the so-called affluent small L Liberal electorates, of which I've represented one for the last 26 years, in the western suburbs of Perth, the eastern suburbs of Adelaide, the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, the north shore of Sydney and the eastern suburbs in Sydney, the western suburbs of Brisbane, are almost all held by the coalition, except now Warringah. So this so-called idea that affluent smaller Liberal voters have turned against the coalition, it's not borne out by the facts, because Warringah was lost not because of climate change, but because there was a particular anger.
So no
message
years. To Scott Morrison or the Liberal government about climate change, as far as you're concerned.
I don't think the election was fought around climate change. It was fought around the economy.
Okay, Alice.
First step would be finding an environment minister that can give an interview and front up and answer questions. Melissa Price was MIA the whole election. Let's be honest, she's been MIA her whole time in the ministry. I've been talking to some people in the ministerial wing about whether she will be dumped completely or whether she'll be given an out-of-ministry portfolio. I don't think Scott Morrison has decided yet. But that would be one step forward. But there is a fundamental reckoning that needs to happen within the factions in the coalition about what to do. I know that some of the independents in the lower house have said that they're interested in bringing back the neg. I don't know whether that will happen, but depending on what will happen in the lower house and how many seats the coalition end up winning, the independents have all come in on a policy, except for Bob Katter. They've all come in and said action on climate change is what we want. So they could be the people that push the government into doing it.
It'll have to be another miracle, because it looks like he's headed for a majority government and he won't have to listen to it.
But the Greens also have 9 seats in the Senate, and no one will have a majority in the Senate, so they'll have to work with someone to get any legislation passed.
Alan Jones.
Oh, dear.
And it's problematic for you if you don't believe in climate change.
Well, look, I mean, this is predicated on the argument that the whole nation out there thinks climate change is the most important issue. They don't. If they did, then Kerryn Phelps has just lost the seat at Wentworth. Now, climate change was the biggest issue there. And what is climate change? I mean, I think the question that the young lady asked over here is very valid. Young people are highly intelligent. They have many platforms from which they can derive their information and their knowledge. But I wonder whether they're being told, or which they're entitled to, all the facts in relation to this.
Oh my.
When I asked... Well, just a moment, Alice, you've been speaking for most of the night. When I asked Tanya Plibersek...
We'll fact-check that one for you.
Yes. When I asked Tanya Plibersek, was the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party and the potential Deputy Prime Minister, was carbon dioxide the big issue in relation to climate change? And she said yes. I then said, well, that being the case, what percentage of the atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide? And she said, I don't know. And I said, hang on, you don't know what percentage of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and yet you're prepared to stand the economy on its head to address a problem, the detail of which you don't know. So when I then explained that the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, Alice, is how much? Alice, how much of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
To answer the question, Scott Morrison has said he believes in climate change and that he wants to do something about it.
Alice, how much carbon dioxide is the problem? How much carbon dioxide is there in the atmosphere?
I'm not a scientist. I don't know. I'm a
well, hang on. If you're going to argue the case, you ought to know. It's 0.04%. And of that 0.04%, human beings around the world create 3%. And of that 3%, Australia creates 1.3%. So for the 1.3% of 3% of 0.04%, we then decide to have a national economic suicide note.
Alan, I'm happy for you to have made that point, which you've made many times on radio, but it has to be answered by others, and particularly by scientists in the long term.
Well, let's go to the thing on. Go ahead. They're maths, not science.
To answer your question about youth, in Queensland, youth unemployment is 25%. So I can understand why they would consider their own survival above climate. But I think if we actually dealt with the employment issue with Queensland, they would also care about climate. Business cares about climate. We heard the Reserve Banks talked about it, the World Banks talked about it. We look at capital flows to fossil fuels around the world is in decline. It's in long-term decline. Pension funds around the world, the second largest global pension fund around the world has announced that they are going to divest of fossil fuels. Why? Because we know that eventually at some point in time, and we need to transition and make sure it's sensible and make sure that people have jobs in that process, that it will become a stranded asset, as in it will be worth nothing, because renewable energy and its reliability and what it can do to de-risk our energy systems and reduce the cost of energy for business and for the entire community, it's already lower than coal. I don't think it is financially viable, which is why we see banks not funding coal-fired power stations. We're seeing insurance companies coming out to say they will no longer at a future point in time actually insure that part of the community. So it is in transition. What we do not have is a plan. We do not have leadership on this because it is going to happen whether we like it or not. The other issue around the global
we're running out of time. Can I just ask you one quick question? From where does business get its advice on the danger of climate change?
We listen to the scientists. We do the analysis. We do an analysis, not just because what one party says one thing or another. We look at it from a risk perspective and we look at it from a return perspective. The return from fossil fuels is going to decline long term. This is not a viable investment option for our country.
OK, Jim Chalmers, final word to you, and if you want to make it an election pitch for the Labor leadership, that's just fine.
Well, how about I answer Ross's question instead? The policy, or the so-called policy that Chris outlined in response to your question, Ross, has been a recipe for pollution going up and electricity prices going up. And Scott Morrison conceded during the campaign that pollution is actually going up. There's an appetite around Australia for us to do something about climate change. There's an appetite for renewable energy because it's cheaper and it's better long-term for the economy. Now, Alice referred to the fact, or the question was about the authority that Scott Morrison might spend on this. I don't think, if he does have authority from this election win on Saturday, I don't think he'll spend it here because there are such a diverse range of views in the party. The party is still hopelessly split on climate policy and on energy policy. Now, Scott Morrison, during the debate, said that Price would be the Environment Minister if they were re-elected. And so we're going to have this continuation of this farcical situation when it comes to environmental policy. And that's problematic as well for getting real action on climate change. In her defence, she's not as tarnished as Angus Taylor is, but she is obviously not the person to carry this argument. So I'm not hopeful that we will start to turn around this challenge that we've got in our economy when it comes to pollution and energy prices.
Quick final question, and it does relate to who will end up being Labor leader. Will anyone in the ranks of the Labor leadership, potential Labor leaders I should say, will any of them change the target that has now been set?
Well, I don't speak for anyone else who might put their hand up. But I do know that in our party, we have a view that we need to deal with climate change, we need to deal with pollution, we need to deal with rising energy costs. We want to see proper investment in renewables, and as Ming rightly points out, that's not just our view, it's the view of the scientists, it's the view of the economists, it's the view of the financial institution, it is the view of the Reserve Bank.
So is the target, in your opinion, is the target untouchable?
Well, I'm not going to announce the target tonight.
There's already a target.
It's 45.
We took a target to the election, and obviously...
So that could change.
Well, everything's up for grabs, Tony. I mean, when you
including
lose
something as fundamental as that.
Well, when you lose an election,
for Q&A.
Let me just answer Tony's question, Alan, before you get too excited. All of our policies, obviously, 48 hours after an election, we don't lock them down for 3 years down the track. I've said that repeatedly.
OK, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Alan Jones, Alice Workman, Christopher Pyne, Jim Chalmers and Ming Long. Thank you very much. You can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by Simon Cowan of the Centre for Independent Studies. Next week on Q&A's panel, France's best-known public intellectual, Bernard-Henri Lévy, one of Australia's leading thinkers, Marcia Langton, People's panellist, anti-racism campaigner and former Greens candidate, Rachel Jacobs, Shadow Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus, and a yet-to-be-confirmed member of the new Morrison government. Until then, good night.